So now we have an opportunity for a number of the stakeholder groups being represented by specific individuals to come up to the front of the room, and we'll have a panel discussion. I will ask for those of you on the panel who haven't already spoken, just to give a quick summary, a précis of who you are, what your organisation is doing, the role that you play in this environment. And then we'll open up the floor to questions. So if I could please ask Vineet and David and Phyllis, Rita, Tracy, and late entrants also Mikiko and Susan as well. So if you could please come up as well. This really does represent an excellent cross-section of the various stakeholder groups. Vineet, the penalty of being closest to the podium, if I could ask you to please kick off. Microphone, sorry, just over there in front of Phyllis.
Hello? Yeah. So I'll do as Peter asked and just give a very, very good, quick, not good, that's for you to judge, précis of who we are and I guess why we're sort of up here, and then pass the mic on because I'm conscious there are a few other folks who also should introduce themselves. So I work for Omidyar Network. We're a philanthropically motivated group. We do both early stage investment in companies as well as early stage grant making to organizations. We are really looking for innovative ideas which we think will have a transformational impact on people's lives. We start from a very sort of people-centric approach. The belief is that everybody has ability, not everybody has opportunity. We have a pretty high risk appetite. We're focused around 5 sectors in particular. And I suspect I'll touch on those later on. I can guess some of the questions that might come through. But we also keep an eye out for interesting experiments. So the reason I'm sitting at this table is that about 3 years ago, we sort of talked to Social Finance, and they said, well, look, they've been getting a lot of reverse inquiries from people interested in these concepts of impact bonds. And is there something we can do to just help the process of responding to them? And that's, we said, yeah, this is an interesting concept. Who knows if it'll work, but if it does work, it could actually be phenomenally powerful in the sort of change that it facilitates. And that certainly seems to be happening in many, many parts of what might be called the global north. The ideas that are being generated are really quite exciting. And then there is the whole international development sector, where I think there's similarly level of ideation. Things, and we're curious to see what happens.
Hi, I'm Rita Parakis from the Center for Global Development. We're possibly the only think tank that's represented in this room. And as a think tank, what we do is produce research to inform very concrete policy proposals that all aim to reduce global poverty and inequality. So like Vineet, I'm speaking from the perspective of a market builder, and not necessarily, and not an organization that would get directly involved in the implementation of a specific transaction. And we were one of the early, I guess, market builders of development impact bonds. And in our role as a think tank, normally what we do with this initiative and others is try to generate good ideas, put them out there, nurture them along, and really hope that others that are in a position to implement them over the long term will really run off with them. And that's what I think we're starting to see with the development impact bond market, thanks to all of the people in this room. So we started working on this question of development impact bonds about 3 years ago. And really, it was around the time that there was a lot of excitement starting to emerge around social impact bonds. And David spoke this morning about the reasons why social finance implemented the first social impact bond and the problems they were trying to address with that. And it was really around how do we focus a social program on the outcomes that really matter for people's lives? How do we bring more rigor to how programs are delivered and measured? how do we create the space for the flexibility and adaptation and innovation that we know are really needed to address the problems at the scale that we're talking about. And these were very clearly problems that existed in the international development space as well. So that's how we kind of got really interested in looking at this model and saw a lot of potential in the model. And for us, it was always about how can we use limited development funding most effectively. So we worked with Social Finance, building on their work on social impact bonds, convened an expert working group, which gave us many fantastic contributions. And our role through that work was really to help develop this concept, build a common understanding around what development impact bonds are. I'm sure most of you have been in a conversation where you've either not understood it or tried to explain it to someone, and there's different ideas about what they are, how and when they could be applied. So we've tried to help to clarify that, think through some of the early pilots, convene different people that are thinking about development impact bonds in different ways. And we really, over time, came to see this as a potentially very valuable approach, not only as a financing mechanism to bring in private investors, but as we're seeing with Peterborough and other social impact bonds, a way to actually improve the business model by which international development programs run. Leave it at that.
Hi everyone, I'm Tracy Austin. I'm from the Difford Impact Fund. So although the name says CDC, just to be clear, we have a separate pool of capital, £75 million, which is available for, largely we do impact funds. And I use the word funds quite loosely because although we follow generally the private equity model, we are actually open to innovative structures and we like to see different proposals. So we've had some proposals from some of you and we've had various conversations. I think the idea is really our objective would be to come in at this from an investor's perspective. Ideally, we'd love to provide some kind of first loss to a private investor who'd be interested in investing in a SIB or a DIB. We have an outstanding RFP program which runs till the end of December, so any interesting proposals, we welcome those. But I think the message and the perspective I come from today is really to say that we're in conversations with co-investors because obviously we couldn't do this alone. And those conversations really come up with the same kind of questions and some of the themes which we've seen, other than obviously whether the fund structure or some kind of facility, pooled facility is the appropriate structure, the cost of doing so. How do investors get some sort of homogeneous or replicable pipeline? Because ultimately investors, if you're going to set aside capital, want to have some visibility of what that capital is going to be spent on. And then just generally, greater sort of conversation pieces around transparency, governance, and again, the cost conversation comes up quite a lot. So our perspective ideally is to see how we can try and mobilize private capital into this space because we fall typically in the DFI sort of mandate. Sure.
Is that on? Okay. I'm Susan DeWitt and I am working at the Bertha Centre for Social Innovation in the Graduate School of Business in the University of Cape Town. So the Bertha Centre is very much kind of in the same model as the Skoll Centre at Oxford, which many of you might know. So there's quite a big focus on teaching, training, and applied research. But along with that, there are three work streams which have a very practical outreach. One is in health, the other is in education, and I'm sitting in the finance team along with Arnie Patton, who some of you may know. My sort of background in the impact bond space would be that I did some research on it during an MBA last year, came and interned with the Cabinet Office this year, and now I'm working with Arnie and Social Finance in designing an impact bond innovation fund in early childhood development. We're not, I wouldn't necessarily term ourselves an intermediary. We are market builders, and we have specific kind of characteristics, which I'll go into later, which enable us to do this job perhaps more effectively than other players in our market at the moment. So, thanks.
Just one final observation. People use the word intermediary and wonder really what it is. I would just, as a personal perspective, say these transactions don't self-combust. there needs to be a careful choreography of all the partners being brought together, and to some extent I define the intermediary as a person who represents the view of the person who isn't in the room, because at the end of the day these are a balancing act of bringing together lots of different actors.
Thank you. I think, in fact, all 7 panel members here are probably market builders in some respect. We are still in that nascent stage. But I will now ask for questions from the room, and please, panel members, if you have questions of your fellow panel members, don't hesitate as well. The hope is that this becomes a really open dialogue.
Hi, Andres Corin, JP Morgan again. Just have a question, because many presenters have mentioned risk-adjusted returns. Just wondering what really goes into that to determine that risk adjustments. And I realize that there's maybe a bit of a timing mismatch, because I just remember the slide that David had up there in terms of the services provided in year 1, and then the services provided, year 2 or 3, that it kind of increased, and there's obviously a cost associated with that, and there's a cost associated with being as with the innovation and the adaptation that you have to do throughout the entire time period of the bond. So I'm just wondering, but you have to determine the risk or the financial targets and returns on day 1. So what kind of risk assessment goes on day 1, knowing that lots of things can change over the course of 5 to 8 years? And then the second part of my question is, what kind of risk management techniques do the investors or the intermediaries have throughout the course of the bond program?
Please, insofar as possible, if you have questions for specific members of the panel, please direct them to them, but otherwise, whoever feels closest to the microphone.
Well, I think just to comment on some of the points you made, there are lots of different aspects of risk. I think when you go to investors with a proposition, you effectively limit the budget. And so what you're using is the intelligence you build up as you deliver the program to reallocate resources. What we have typically done is keep a small amount of money available for innovation. We call it the Evolution Fund in a number of our transactions, but it's essentially money that is used to buy in discretionary support. But the really fundamental reorganization of certainly Peterborough was about reallocating money towards more volunteer support, more mental health support. And that wasn't a net increase in resources, it was a decision to spend money differently. But in order to do that, you have to be tracking, as far as you can, what correlates with a better outcome, and then go back and use that feedback loop to take real-time decisions. Probably we have a governance group which gets together 7 times a year, and it's a very transparent conversation. And the interesting piece of that is that every time you spend any money, there is the debate about the social and the financial return. And it is not something you can hardwire into a contract, it's the way you live it. And every decision you need to think of both dimensions.
So if I can just add from our experience so far, and bearing in mind ours is a very new facility, so we've only closed our first fund in March of this year, and that's just obviously a very general example, but I'd say that every one of our propositions, the due diligence is really what we spend a lot of time on, and that's really getting to understand that risk, and that's done on a case-by-case basis. So I think the conversation is really in relation to what the proposition is, and that's very much interrogated by in our instance, our team directly firsthand. In terms of balancing our risk sort of reward profile and how we choose to balance that, we see it as it varies from proposition to proposition. Ours is a fund that likes to balance or needs to balance impact delivery as well as a financial return. So we're not, and although our name is in many instances slightly misleading because it's the DFID Impact Fund, we're not about grant giving. So for us it is about seeking some kind of return. But all I could say generally is that it's very much agreed on a case-by-case basis, and it's about understanding the proposition at hand. And I think that's the most practical way we found so far, but again, early days.
Tom Sanderson, BBC Media Action. The UBS Optimus DIB, it seemed, if you were to imagine the table or the panel and one of you is the investor, one is the outcome funder, one is the delivery partner. It seemed that under the Optimus thing, your philanthropists are taking the seat of the investor, and then SIF, who is also a philanthropic fund, is taking the seat of the outcome funder. But in the sleeping sickness one, it's development institutions or bilateral donors who are taking the seat of the outcome funder, and the private sector taking the seat of the other one, the investors. So, is it the case that different parts of our community can take these different seats depending on what they want, or over time are we expecting the bilateral donors always to be in the seat, or even national government ministries of agriculture or ministries of health to take the seat of the outcome funder, and others ordinarily to take the seat of the investors, and maybe NGOs or civil society or particular practitioners to take the seat of the delivery people? How do you see the people taking those seats and the family functioning and cooperating together?
Well, I'll start the response, and then I think my colleagues probably can add to it. So from our perspective, we're representing private individual donors. We will never be able to scale to the level of a bilateral or a multilateral donor or a government. So we have no delusions about that. But what we want to do is try to get our clients to use their money wisely. So we're only in a position right now to have private investors act as the investor. But in an ideal world, if I look more globally, that's not how we're going to scale it, for sure. We need to scale it with governments, with bilateral donors, and there's a lot of other ways. But we could be a tipping point. So we could use this small DIB and these individual private investors to act as a demonstration that this really works. Now, we could have played the role of the outcome payer. And ultimately, what we might do is play every single part. It'll be a one-man show. We'll have our clients, we'll be the investors, UBS will be the outcome payer. We'll still need an intermediary because that is just complicated. And we'll still obviously need a third-party evaluator to give the whole deal some integrity. But I can envision a world where we would play both roles, or our universe would play both roles.
It's a great question. I mean, what is happening right now is market building. So if we just use as an example what's the domestic UK. So when Bridges Ventures raised what was at that time the world's first social impact bond fund, they said there's reasons for that. There's coordination gains and to help this evolved sector. We were one of the initial LPs that helped anchor that. At that time, most of the LPs were people who were sort of saying, we're philanthropically motivated. The rationale was, if this as an asset class performs, so if it delivers an impact and if it performs in a way that you can actually say to investors, there is something here, then you need to create these wholesale vehicles. Now, they've just done a final close for more than what they had anticipated. And what's really interesting is two of the LPs who've come in, there's a bank that's come in, but two of the LPs who've come in and who are amongst the largest LPs are pension funds. So not, there's the European Investment Fund and other various folks, but they're local authority pension funds. They're saying, there is something here. And this goes to I think, it starts to echo what we're seeing, some of the pension fund investors saying, there's this question of, okay, social impact, what's the return, what's the risk-adjusted return? An interesting question is, what's the correlation? If this, as an asset class, isn't that correlated to the public equity markets, actually 4%, 5%, 6% is huge. Give me as much of it as you possibly can. That's what's motivating the pension funds into this. Now, the Bridges Fund is small. UK is a relatively small market. Goldman has decided that it's going to raise probably 10 times that as a fund in the US from its investor base as just as a normal investment fund. That's what will next happen. And I think it will definitely be a journey.
I'll just very quickly add to that. A lot of the conversations that we have are with foundations or large NGOs or different types of organizations that are really trying to figure out where they would sit on this. So I think that's where your question probably comes from, because there is a lot of that going on. But I also just wanted to point out that the outcomes funding ultimately is grant funding. The question came up this morning around fiscal savings, and in all of the DIBs that I've seen so far proposed, there isn't that model where there's fiscal savings being generated, so the money has to come from somewhere, and that's grant funding. It's just a less risky form of grant funding because it's on the basis of results. So the question for the outcome funder is, we have this money, do we want to fund this project up front, or do we see some benefit in doing it this other way and paying for the result and in the role of the investor and the intermediary and the other actors that are involved in the impact bond model?
Sorry, if I can just add something very small to that. So we would only see ourselves as an investor or first loss provider to an investor prospectively. But for us, the limitation and the obvious questions, obviously we have the same shareholder being DFID. We wouldn't be able to be an investor into a facility where you had DFID as an outcomes payer because it's seen as being from one pocket to the other. So we prefer the blended outcomes payer mix of parties, to be honest.
Hi, this is Katrina Mackay from the Department for International Development. Obviously, we've been talking a lot today about blended returns, about investors being motivated by both financial and social returns. I'd be really interested in the panel's comments on the advantages and especially the disadvantages of combining those two things, rather than, for example, just investing money for the highest returns and then spending some of that money you get back on achieving social returns. And connected to that, I'd be interested in any comments on the medium and long-term sustainability of the development impact bond model, should interest rates in general start to pick up.
Well, I think just to offer a perspective on the first point, which is, as UBS commented, the cost of giving away money is enormous. That actually the minus 100% return is something that is clearly very important in a number of situations, but is not sustainable at scale. And therefore, there is real value in exploring whether there is an opportunity to offer some financial return alongside a defined social purpose. I don't for a minute underestimate some of the challenges in reconciling that, but I think as we've tried to articulate, if you can define an outcome which is attractive from a social point of view and link financial returns to that, you resolve a number of the governance challenges that I think you may be concerned about in putting the question forward. In terms of the second question about sustainability, I absolutely understand the need for us all to focus on that. I think it's a question of, firstly, a comparison here is, would you use a DIB or would you grant fund an exercise? And I think there you can look at two aspects. One is the effectiveness of delivery and the likelihood that the outcomes are delivered, and benchmark both mechanisms, if you like, by those criteria. The second question is a really important one, which is how do we know that whatever change we fund, whether it be by way of a DIB or a grant, actually leads to long-term change which is embedded and sustainable. And I don't underestimate the challenge of that latter piece. But I think all of us, whether we're grant funders or investors, care about getting that right too.
If I can just add to that, I mean, this is just speaking from an ON perspective, we don't see it as necessarily as stark as, well, it's either just about making money or it's just about giving it away. I mean, it's a continuum. And what the right type of capital is for something, it depends upon what the underlying objective is. So we do see that it's, we don't think it's as stark as that. What's really interesting is that it's, the idea will not work in all cases. Sometimes just doing it executing it as a government program will probably be the best thing. Sometimes just doing it as a grant. Sometimes just making an equity investment. But there is plenty of space where there is a value from these types of concepts. And what's intriguing is, I think it's still in development mode, but in the US, some insurance companies are saying, actually, we pay out on when people fall ill. They are looking at being the payer for impact bonds that would be aimed at, particularly in that case, I think, asthma and respiratory diseases. So now that's a solution entirely within the private sector, because they're saying there is something to this. And that really goes to the underlying what. What is this actually financing? Is it some sort of innovative approach? Is it a bundling of innovative approaches? Is it actually the process of gathering more data so that you can course correct rapidly? That's, at the end of the day, it's just a tool. This is a financing instrument. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not right. But really, for us, it's the what. And if that's interesting, then you start to look at, okay, what's the best way of financing it?
Hi, so Richard Morton from GRM. The question was raised earlier as to who should initiate a development impact bond. And it seems to me, I may have got this wrong, but primarily this is a form of procurement for the outcome funder. Ultimately, the outcome funder is the one footing the bill. So my question would be, when a lot of donors, DFID particularly, are moving to results-based payments, where the contractor is prepared to accept the risk of payment on delivery or not, then what are the circumstances in which you need to go beyond that and engage an additional investor beyond the investment that the contractor, people like GRM, are prepared to provide?
I understand the point, and certainly I think there is a question of scale. There's a question of motivation of investors. I think these structures are, if I may say, they need to be designed in a way which is sensitive to the needs of all the various counterparties. And I think that's one of the challenges which we're still working through. But the design phase is a complex one. If you take the example in the UK of the Ministry of Justice, they were very excited by Peterborough. They ran off and then started to work through their own idea of what they'd like to do at scale. This is going back 2 or 3 years. And they came up with the most perfectly designed structure from their point of view, but it was almost impossible to raise capital for it because the investors couldn't see the change that they would be creating through participating. And so I think if you are looking to raise capital, you have to be sensitive to their ambitions. And sometimes we should all acknowledge the two can't be matched. And that's perfectly understandable. We shouldn't necessarily say this is always possible. But I think that exercise is a balancing act. And I think it's uncomfortable in the current procurement regime, whereby, if you like, design takes place in isolation before something is tendered publicly.
Sorry, if I may just add from the side of an investor that obviously invests alongside other investors. Generally, people think investors are aligned when they start to do these things together, and I can tell you that even in the specific space that we function in generally as an impact investor, the amount of conversations we've had around hurdle rates, returns, how to measure outcomes, that's probably the longest running debate that still continues. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is that there's this perception around investor alignment, which is actually really critical up front. And that's still an ongoing discussion. So it's a really big challenge.
Also, don't underestimate the legal framework, and that plays a big role in determining the design of this, not just investor preferences, but also from a bank's perspective, and my colleague at JP Morgan, I'm sure, can attest to this, the internal compliance regulations play a huge role in determining the type of structure that we can work within.
Hi, I'm Alison Griffith from Practical Action. I'm fairly picking up on something that Vineet, you just said about depends what the underlying objective is, and I was just reminded of a conversation that we were having with the World Bank last week on the objectives of one of their new programs on benchmarking the business of agriculture, and linking that to their big goals of ending extreme poverty. And some of the discussions that we were having around theories of change and the complexities. And somebody mentioned earlier this morning about log frames, and we, I was going to say love them and hate them. Probably, if you're a practitioner, mostly hate them, particularly when you're working in complex systems. And there is something very appealing about what you've been saying this morning about, adaptive management and the flexibility. But I just wanted to hear a little bit more from some of the panel about their thoughts on keeping those big goals, those big development goals, kind of front and central of this, and what experience you've had with developing theories of change. Thank you.
Shall I leap in here? Well, I think, again, our program's new, but I think one of the advantages is that in the consideration when DFID set up this facility was to say that, first of all, given that we're actually asking really underdeserved portions of populations globally to report and provide data in environments where capacity building is generally stretched to begin with, that is in itself a huge task. So the first thing is everything we've done and we do is by proxy, but we do follow log frames. But at every stage, be it at an investee level, at a fund manager level, and even at our level where we have an MOU with DFID, there is some period for reflection and review and some kind of verification process through sampling or however we go about it, deep dives, and that's all still being worked out. But I think there's a conscious reflection that you cannot, these things are, our time frames are long, so we're talking 10-year time frames. So for us, it's not about agreeing something statically up front and saying we have to stick to that or else we failed. I think part of maybe the failure then in itself is proving the success of what this can or cannot be. That's just from our perspective.
If you look at the overall objective, so eliminating poverty, then we have to ask ourselves the question, not what is UBS Optimist Foundation's theory of change, because our theory of change is quite different than anybody else's theory of change sitting up here. Our theory of change is about using wealthy people's philanthropic money in the most effective and innovative way. Now, we could debate that. But if we were to look at the overall objective of eliminating poverty, then we're forced to ask ourselves the question, what's the best way to do that? And if we ask ourselves the question as to whether or not a DIB is the best way to do that, I think from an economic perspective, the answer might be no. The answer might be, well, the most efficient way is to just give poor people money. It might be to give them poor people an asset that they could then use to generate their own wealth. So the theory of change concept is a complicated one, especially if we're looking at an overarching objective. And so the DIB requires a tremendous leap of faith and also looking at the objective. So the reason that we're doing the DIB is to try to get wealthy people to do good philanthropy. And not yet to eliminate poverty.
Can I just add to that as well? So I'm be speaking from a much smaller perspective and a kind of smaller scale project. But in terms of keeping big development goals in mind, I suppose every development agency or government has their own trajectory. And so generally they're building on what is existing, and they don't even have different end goals often. What we are being very careful to do within our design process, I'll chat about it a bit more later, is just be very aware of where in the trajectory our innovation fund might fit, and be careful not to parachute that onto an existing system which might not be ready for it, or in fact we might be way behind where people's thinking is. And so that very much we're building that into our design process, and that's through a lot of talking with stakeholders, government stakeholders.
It's your question. It's a great question. I think, to my mind, it sort of touches upon two things. One is incentives, and the other is prescription. So transaction design is really important. If you get the design wrong, there will be perverse incentives, or they could be perverse incentives. And so this is where the role of the intermediary, we don't think it should. It can be, it certainly shouldn't be underestimated. Both in thinking through very carefully what are the perverse incentives that might creep in, and therefore what needs to be guarded against? What's the sort of data that needs to be captured along the way? And perverse incentives aren't just because of impact bonds. I mean, the horrible things that have been happening around female sterilization in India, government programs can also create some pretty bad incentives. So this is just a question to really be very thoughtful about this. To some extent, you could argue the point that Phyllis made earlier, that by really saying this whole, whatever the transaction is designed with specific, tangible, concrete outcomes in mind, it really acts as a lens. It forces people to think, okay, is this the outcome, and what are the things that could go wrong? The other question around big development outcomes is this approach of well, we know what to do, and it can just, prescribe it. This is what needs to be done, and then therefore let it happen. I mean, it doesn't work like that. Nothing really works like that. So I think that goes to a more philosophical question of what is the most conducive way of getting an environment where drivers for change happen. I don't mean drivers for change, because I know there's a different phrase that used to be. But if I can give an example, because this starts to touch upon, okay, if an impact bond works, what happens next? And again, I think we think it's case by case. So there was in the space of education, there was a really exciting randomized control trial done in Western Kenya, where they said they took contract teachers, and they found that sure enough, if you have contract teachers, they perform better. So the Kenyan government said, okay, we're going to turn this into a nationwide policy. They randomized that. So in some parts of Kenya, it was contract teachers administered by the government. In other parts, they outsourced it to, in that case, NGOs who went out, hired, and managed the contract teachers. And then they tracked that. I mean, it's fascinating. They found that where the government was managing the contract teachers, there was no impact. And where the NGOs were managing the contract teachers, there was impact on education outcomes. And the reason I'm bringing this is not anti-government, government bashing. This goes to more organizational design questions of at where do you say, okay, we know something works. Now, how do you industrialize it? Is it by internalizing the whole operations, or is it by saying, actually, give it back to the people, give it back to the communities, and they can decide at how they self-organize around this and how they execute these things. I think these are completely open questions. And at a higher enough level, that's the more interesting question of if an impact bond is piloted and it shows something works, what happens next? It may be internalization, it may be something completely different.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Bryant. I'm with the Gates Foundation. And it's really great to hear all of this morning, and I've really had a lot of information and an insight that I'm excited to bring back to my colleagues in Seattle. Quick question I had on the outcome funding. So I think potentially is a sweet spot for the foundation's involvement is understanding when and how innovative financial instruments draw in new and additional money to a development project. So it'd be great to hear the Global Fund's experience and UBS's experience with trying to get new sources of financing as outcome funders, perhaps alongside a foundation or another public bilateral, multilateral entity. So with the Global Fund, you mentioned You mentioned that there was a mining company that was potentially interested, and I think maybe it's not the same DIB, but Nando's had been interested. And then for UBS, if you thought about others to work alongside of SIF, I think you guys have worked with SECO before, with an SME fund. So if you were able to draw in any governments as well? And what have you seen as to be the appetite, particularly from governments and private investors in this area? Thank you.
So I did mention that we were looking at a consortium of entities compromising the outcome funders. So the Global Fund being the largest funders in the malaria space would be one, but private sector companies such as mining companies would be a natural. We have had some discussions with some of the mining companies. They were still sort of challenged as to how could they justify the return if the program is able to successfully be implemented, the return that they pay back to the investor. It's a new mechanism. It hasn't been tested. So even though there are many studies as to the cost and benefit of implementing malaria intervention programs, particularly for mining companies, sort of bottom line, it was still quite a challenge in order to convince them. But I think that that was really a natural fit to get them on board. The other was because we saw the development impact bond as another way of getting higher value for money. Some of the bilateral organizations, I've mentioned that we're pretty much funded by governments, so some of the like-minded bilateral agencies could be another partner. And but it all boils down to where actually are you going to do this pilot? How much does it cost, and so forth. And because of the various different challenges that I mentioned, we weren't able to get to that stage.
We also had, so we only accept donations, or we can only have outcome payers, not in the case of SIF, but that come through the foundation have to be a client. We had an extraction company come to us when they heard about the DIB to say, we're interested, and our compliance team wouldn't let us work with them. So there are a lot of companies where now we got a call, actually, I just got an email this morning from a very well-known clothing company who's not a client of ours, but they would like to get involved in the DIB as part of their corporate social responsibility. We also are hearing from a lot of our individual clients who have family foundations. They know that it's going to cost them between 15 to 20% of their annual grant-making budget in order to build up an infrastructure to make good grants. And they want to save that money. And so they like the idea of becoming an outcome payer because they don't have to spend the money, that 15 to 20%. It saves them quite a bit of money, and they're only paying for the outcomes. So particularly for family foundations, I think this is a really attractive tool.
Hello, I'm Clara from Nathan Associates, and we specialize in private sector development. We're very interested in the DIB model. And I know that you've all talked about it in different ways, but we really are concerned about the sustainability aspects of the model. And I would just like to know if there's any thought that is being given at this stage, because it's a very innovative instrument that is being developed. Is there any trend that you're discovering or that you're thinking about towards local ownership, towards if DIB is piloted, is successful? Will there be an interest for it to be self-sustaining, for it to be, appropriated by the people that really can make a change locally? Or will it always depend on CSR and philanthropy, which are things that can, just move away in terms of their interest in this instrument? So, yeah, thank you.
But, I think that we have a responsibility to look at DIBs the same way we would look at any other grant. And any smart grant maker will make grants to programs that are sustainable and that have local community engagement and involvement and ownership. And I think DIBs should follow the exact same criteria. We held Educate Girls to the same criteria that we would hold any other grant to, which included sustainability and community engagement. And the hope is that the government will take this over. All of the things that probably most grant makers in the room also subscribe to. So I wouldn't look at it any other way.
Yeah, I think one of the strengths of the model is that it gives the local actors, whether it's NGOs or just representatives of civil society in some way, more empowerment to solve problems on their own, to figure out what's needed. And that's what's happening with Educate Girls. They're working within the public school system, but they have the flexibility to do what, as the local group that knows the community really well, to adapt their model to what works in a way that would be much more difficult or impossible to do under an input-based funding model. And I also found it very interesting that Phyllis said in her first presentation that the ultimate goal is to demonstrate what works, and for the government to start to incorporate that into the public school model. So this is also a way to test more innovative approaches and then incorporate them into the system.
Just from kind of perhaps a developing country point of view, so we're creating a SIB or potentially a hybrid DIB-SIB. The Innovation Fund we're hoping will finance between 5 and 10 SIBs, so in a similar kind of model to the DWP Innovation Fund. And perhaps this is rather kind of a crude thinking around what our exit strategy could be from the Innovation Fund. There are a number of exit strategies that we've thought of. One is because we're working in a relatively new and kind of fragmented sector, it would be to identify 4 or 5 organizations that are doing a great job, strengthen them, and by the end of the kind of contractual period, get them into a position where they could potentially scale up in various other ways, and be having that conversation throughout the life of the SIB to enable them to do that. The second could potentially be that there is a bigger innovation fund that's created, and so those or more organizations are funded on the same basis. And I think there's an interesting question around the reason why SIBs seem to achieve good outcomes. Is it because we're just able to run an innovative program that seems to be showing signs that it's working, and the government wouldn't have otherwise implemented that program? Or is it because you've got all these intermediaries and investors looking over the shoulder and creating that oversight that enables it to kind of work, and the kind of stringent M&E? And then perhaps the third, and maybe holy grail, if you're a government, would be to scale up in terms of outcomes-based procurement. In other words, we've identified a number of outcomes. We see that there are players in the market that can do this. And so from now on, when we put tenders out into the market, that's how organizations are going to be paid. That is less likely in our context. And so probably we would be looking at the first one in terms of that sustainability.
I think it's a great question, and I have to say it's highly relevant to us at Social Finance as we look ahead over the next 12 months, because 2 of our SIBs are coming to an end, and they are informing discussions in very different ways. And I have to say, not ways, if you like, that we foresaw when we set off. So to some extent, the sustainability beds in because people have worked with the operations and have developed their own models around them and want to sustain elements of them. I mean, if you take Peterborough, the support we provide is for short sentence male offenders, but within a year of our operating, the prison had decided to commission the same service for women. Now that's going to carry on, and I think that is one of those dividends of actually demonstrating what might work on the ground. I know that people are very interested in the training company that we've created within Peterborough, and I think that will continue as a social enterprise in the area. Which from the point of view of our investors is a wonderful legacy to leave behind. And I think the police are going to miss us. And they're thinking within the Police and Crime Commission budget how they can replicate some of what we do. None of this would have happened without that period of sustained partnership over several years. In one of our other SIBs, there is actually quite an interesting bit of analysis going on at the moment where working with 14 to 16-year-olds on the edge of the workplace, the schools are very excited by the level of engagement that the services managed to achieve, and actually we've learnt a lot about what outcomes are possible at what cost, and there is possibly a much better deal that government could fund where we're benefiting from the learning about what works and what the costs and risks of delivering certain outcomes. And it may look a lot cheaper, but that's essentially capturing the benefit of the learning in the first phase. So there are all sorts of things that can emerge. And I don't think it's easy up front, other than to say we want the system to change or absorb what we learn. It'll do so in lots of different ways.
Good afternoon. My name is Kent Ford. I'm with GRM International, and I'm the program director of a project in Nigeria funded by DFID called Prop Cup My Karfi. And we're using a grants mechanism within that program in a very creative way to fund a number of different initiatives, one or two of which could actually be created as a DIB. So I'm very optimistic. I think that this whole approach is interesting. As DIBs become more popular, optimistically as I state that, I'm sort of thinking the optics of this, especially when you have high net worth individuals and rich folks making money off of development projects and development outcomes. And I mean, I got the balance and I understand all that, and I have some ideas on that, but I suggest that we have a messaging issue here, and as they become more popular, and I like the revolving fund of UBS, I think that's sort of interesting. One way, of course, is just to keep reinvesting that money and it becomes philanthropy. You have CSR, of course, but then also there is the profit motive, and I, being a growth and livelihoods professional, for 25 plus years in development, I truly believe that the private sector is the greatest anti-poverty program ever created. However, we have to be able to message that to the larger public. And my only comment is, that's the comment, and the question is, what have people thought about that? How have we been able to address it? Has anyone come up with any sort of really cool, neat messages or ideas on how to address that issue to the public when that question comes at us?
Go on, David.
I think it's a really important journey we're on, because I think there are perceptions of people's respective roles and motivations which often are out of line with what the true intent is. I actually always think that fundamentally any of these services have got to work in terms of the beneficiary and the social problem. And that is the reason everyone got together to put them together. And so long as you can manage the risk of perverse incentives and keep the purity or the focus on the social purpose, most of the questions you raise actually are manageable, because at the end of the day, the end is being hopefully delivered in an effective and sensitive way.
I agree with that. And I mean, if you look at companies that are selling products to the bottom of the pyramid, Unilever, they face the same issue. But like you, most people believe that big, large-scale change will come from the private sector and from government. And, our small philanthropic donations won't be the thing that really creates large-scale change for bottom of the pyramid. So I don't see it as a huge risk, and I completely agree that if we say we're focused on outcomes here, and despite the fact that we're doing it as a revolving fund, I mean, at some point we might say we will actually give a return to our investors here. I don't see that as a big risk. You also have the same issue with low-cost private schools. It's another model that seeks to be financially sustainable off of the backs of poor people to give their children a good education. So I don't see it as a huge risk, to be honest.
Hello, my name is Morten Schmidt. I'm from Oxfam. We're beginning to explore development impact bonds as well, with shaky legs and a lot of precaution. We see many pros in this new model of development financing. We certainly also see a lot of cons. And we are very carefully analyzing it against many other different types of development financing that we're operating with. One of the justifications that we're getting into this area is that we see it as an opportunity to engage with governments, that we see it as a way for resource-weak governments in low and middle-income countries to start committing to deliver basic services for more disenfranchised parts of the population. But we haven't heard a whole lot this morning about the difficulties engaging with governments. So my question to the panel is, where do you see key challenges to engaging, not with governments in the north, but low and middle-income governments, to become outcome payers, possibly in consortia with other types of donors?
My whole talk is about that. So I don't know how much information I should give now. South Africa is a middle-income country, and so could well afford to be an outcomes payer, and we're certainly negotiating with them and working with them on that basis. I think that perhaps one of the things not to do is underestimate governments. And so and certainly our experience has been that there are numerous champions and key development guys within government that are very capable of taking it forward. It's just finding them and working very closely with them. I'm going to leave the rest for the talk.
I've had some conversations with the Permanent Secretary of Mozambique's Ministry of Health, and the reason why he was very interested was he thought this would be a great platform to engage the private sector companies, particularly the mining companies that were operating in parts of the country. So because typically these mining companies do have some malaria programs for their employees or the community that they operate, they tend to not be so coordinated with the rest of the malaria programs that are being carried out in the country or in the province. So the government really had an interest in trying to use this mechanism as another way of coordinating some of the activities in certain areas of the country. The other reason why they were interested is that, I mean, low-income countries are very much relying on grants from, from the Global Fund, from PMI, the U.S. Big Malaria Initiative, and other bilateral agencies. So it's grants, but still there's a lot of gap. There's still a gap, and they felt that this is a way to, it's a front-loading mechanism to do it. We've also talked with our colleagues in the country teams in Latin America, which tend to be more middle-income countries, and these countries are eventually going to be transitioning out of the Global Fund. They would no longer be eligible to receive grants because of the income level. But because they still also have a gap in terms of financing their basic health programs, they were interested. We're still sort of exploring it, but that's where the Global Fund is no longer an outcome funder, but we're just sort of giving a little bit of advice, given that we have been working and looking at it. We have not yet gotten a strong traction, but it could be a possibility. But with malaria, you have more higher burden in countries that are lower income. So that's why you see a lot of the burden is concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. And you have less burden in the upper middle income countries. But you still need a certain amount of malaria intervention programs in order to make sure that the country is either at a pre-elimination stage or about to get into the elimination or eradication stage. And maybe an impact bond is not the way to go about it. We are also looking at trust funds for the countries to develop. So you have a certain, a principle that's invested in the trust fund, and by using the interest, that could sustain the malaria intervention program that the country needs. It's only a little. So, I don't think a DIB is the only solution. It's one way of doing it, and you have to look at what is the problem, what's the need, and what's the appropriate tool for it.
It's a very fair question. I mean, and I can just sort of share. I can't share the names yet, but to your question of the government, I mean, what intrigues us is what we're seeing is often at a subnational level. So in East Africa, at a subnational level, where you have the senior politicians and senior sort of reformers, even on the civil service side, saying, we know things have to change, or we know we want to deliver these services. We have finite budgets. The government has finite capacity to actually deliver. So there are choices. So they can either say, well, we're going to invest in another government delivery program, where often the people at the top of the government say, you know, I don't have a huge amount of confidence in my own machine to be able to deliver this. But fundamentally, what I'm trying to do here is deliver this for the benefit of my constituencies. They're the ones who elected me, and they're the ones who I have to satisfy. How do I do this? So we are seeing some signals where people are saying, actually, is this a mechanism for government to get things to start happening in a way? So to crowd in other people's risk capital to take the risk so that they're being more prudent with the limited taxpayers' money themselves. Is it a mechanism to allow almost participatory development, where you have local entrepreneurs who are now in a position where they can get upfront medium-term risk capital to actually deliver solutions without being constrained by any donor's log frame? I mean, you know, if you take it to its logical conclusion, what this as a concept does, it says someone saying, we'll pay for the outcomes, for these outcomes, we agree on what the, you know, is it a valuable outcome to reduce malaria, or is it a valuable outcome to get girls into school? And if we agree that yes, yes. Now, you guys decide how you're going to do this, but you have to deliver this. And then these are the local change agents, local entrepreneurs, who have to then go and convince someone to say, I know this problem enough that will you back me? And if it's done right, it's basically what Peterborough was. It's an exercise in participatory development. It's taking people who are away from the problem saying, well, we're going to tell you what you should do and how you should do it. And if you deviate even 5% from this, you have to come back to us, to saying, we trust you, right? Take this risk capital. You better be collecting data, but we trust your commitment to the problem and your ability to course correct that we'll take this risk.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Duncan Parker from a company called Ethical Goods, but I'm actually representing a number of INGOs who are interested in impact investing in its widest sense, but obviously DIBS to the forefront today. Having experienced various types of investment into developing countries, whether it was microfinance, whether it's into SME, various different models, and perhaps before DIBS were called DIBS, having seen things that are quite similar. One of the things that railroaded and kind of shunted from the side some of those projects was philanthropy money coming in and doing the thing that you were wanting to do in a sustainable way through investment. I've seen those things fail, and in the kind of the humanitarian in me celebrates that more money is being leveraged and therefore more things are happening within those communities. But if the particular investment project that you're focusing on is being knocked off its rails because of other money coming into community, how does one measure impact if other people are doing things that are equally focused on the issue at hand, and B, where does that fit within a DIB particularly? My mind's racing all over the place in terms of whether it's positive or negative, or actually how do you measure it? So I can't direct it at any one individual, so whoever is interested in that.
I'm happy to start off. We've had this same issue, also investing in low-cost private schools where there are equity investors alongside donors. The key lesson we've learned is they have to be separate. So we don't want to educate girls that they can no longer accept philanthropic money and grants while we're doing the DIB. because they wouldn't be where they are today without it, and they need it. So, but it's important to ring fence our area. So we're working in a very defined district with a very clear set of schools, and there'll be no contamination of that population with other types of investments of philanthropic money. When you're looking at a social investment, similarly, we now have rules that if we're making a grant, there can be no equity investments coming in at the same time. So we'll give a grant in the early stage, and then the grantee can only begin to accept debt or equity financing after our grant has terminated, because it leads to all sorts of undesirable outcomes.
We actually try and see it in a similar light. We obviously haven't done a DIB, but we try and have the same perspective in terms of keeping it separate. I think also, again, coming to private investors, the first question they generally ask is about viability and whether something on a ring-fence basis is sustainable, and that's easily answered if you keep it separate.
Hi, my name is Sayaka Koseki with Futures Group. I had a question with regards to how the investor fund is actually accounted for more from a legal kind of tax perspective. Just the thought came to mind because Phyllis, you mentioned how this is really being kind of put up as a philanthropy rather than an investment, where the clients aren't expecting a return. Versus clearly there was a return that was made in the Peterborough case. So is it just that depending on the SIB or DIB structure, the investor's money is accounted for as a tax deductible kind of money as if a donation, versus in some other cases it's actually an investment that wouldn't typically be a tax deduction, say for donation to a 501c3. This is a US language, but I would assume similar applies in UK and other places.
It's different in every single country. So we set this up as simply a grant. Actually, formally it's a loan. And we can do that through a nonprofit. And we're a Swiss-based nonprofit. We also have a UK Optimus Foundation. We can do it in the UK. We couldn't do it in the US. So it depends on the jurisdiction. In Switzerland, if we wanted to give the money back, we'd have to have set up a special purpose vehicle, which would have taken a very long time. And for a proof of concept, it wouldn't be worth it. So we looked at the most expedient way to do it in Switzerland, and that was by giving a loan.
Can you hear me? Good. I think it's a critical issue. Getting around these, we did get US investors subject to PRI to come into Peterborough, and there was quite a lot of interesting discussions around that. There is a wonderful thing called a limited partnership, which is tax transparent. So it essentially allows a lot of investors with different motivations to come together and different legal constraints and essentially not be bound by the vehicle. And so I think there's a lot of thinking going on around this area, but that is one of the more hopeful lines of inquiry. But the answer is no two investors are the same on this issue. The 5013C constraints are quite specifically US, but they have so far been able to invest in our products.
Sorry, not to be too controversial, but limited partnership in itself, depending on where it's incorporated, is also an issue amongst investors. For example, we can't do Luxembourg because of OECD lack of tax on transparency. So I think it's just, again, it's a case-by-case basis. That's our experience.
Arnav Acharya from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. How do you see, especially DFID and Global Fund, how do you see this fitting into SWAP and the sector-wide funds that, do you see in many of the projects that I see from DFID or Global Fund approved projects, there tends to be not very good transparency as to how to evaluate projects. So is there something that actually something like SIB or DIB can actually sort of institute more evaluation-oriented projects. Do you think, I mean, I think Ms. Dewitt was mentioning that SIB or DIB would actually have more innovative projects, which I don't exactly know why they would have it more than, let's say, DFID or a global fund working with the country. So it could be true, I mean, and that you would have some more innovative projects. So the question is that basically, how would this fit into SWAP, and is it actually creating a lot more things that Paris Declaration was supposed to actually reduce?
Does everybody know what SWAP is?
Yeah, sorry.
Do you want to explain SWAP?
Okay, sorry, then maybe I shouldn't answer. SWAP is basically trying to reduce number of development projects that come singly into a country. It tried to reduce single projects. It tried to have more countries, Global Fund or other countries to put money into a single fund for a sector, for example, education or health. So probably I shouldn't have asked this question then.
I just think, again, sorry, not to be misled by the name of the DFID Impact Fund, this is one application of DFID's money. So there are some DFID people here. Maybe somebody else is better placed to comment on this. I wouldn't be able to be honest.
Thanks very much. I think we're running out of time and it's time for lunch. So I'll get Peter to just wrap up and take us through to lunch.
I'm sure we all still have some questions, but that was fascinating. Thanks very much for everyone on the panel. There will, of course, be opportunities over lunch to continue the discussion, but I am aware this is probably the only hard deadline that we have, the 1 o'clock lunchtime time, because there are others in the building who will be queuing up shortly thereafter. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel and enjoy the lunch.